Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to another HRO Today Educational Podcast. I'm Elliot Clark, the CEO of HRO Today. We publish HRO Today Magazine, HRO Today EMEA, and HRO Today APAC. We're the producers of the HRO Today forums and educational events held around the world and the managers of the HRO Today Association. I'm excited about today's podcast because we're going to talk about one of the new old things in the world of HR. It seems eventually we remember things that used to work really well and they're coming back. One of the hottest new catchphrases in the lexicon of HR is the idea of skills-based hiring. I'm making air quotes with my hands when I say that. Now, skills-based hiring can be interpreted in many ways, and the programs can take differing forms. But the underlying concept, if you're not familiar with it, is that many hiring programs are broken in that they look for keywords and educational credentials and exact matching that may not reflect actual skills. This also ignores that many skills may have been honed in unrelated fields. For example, many salespeople move into recruiting, but their resumes don't have any recruiting experience. Companies are realizing that many good candidates are being ignored that could be quickly trained into productivity with just a little bit of effort. It used to be that companies did this all the time and trained and mentored people. But as we moved away from that, companies wanted to recruit exact matching. So in a sense, we're back to the future. However, to install this philosophy of skills-based hiring is complex and involves considerable change management. So we have a great expert to help us understand how to do it. Deanne Barbary, or Dee, is the Vice President and Senior Client Partner, Korn Ferry RPO in the APAC region and hails to us from lovely Melbourne, Australia. She's been with Korn Ferry for nearly 6 years, has been an executive in the RPO industry since 2006. Though she's in APAC, she has coordinated some of the largest RPO client engagements globally for Korn Ferry and has experience in creating, or should I say recreating, an environment for skills-based hiring. Korn Ferry, of course, is one of the largest providers of RPO services, technology, and consultation, executive search, etc. They're one of the largest in the world. The RPO division is also one of the most highly rated providers on the HRO Today Baker's Dozen RPO for more than a decade. Dee, welcome to the podcast. Is there anything you'd like to add about Korn Ferry for our audience?
Thank you, Elliot. It's a pleasure to be here. So yes, about Korn Ferry, as you said, we're a global organizational consulting firm who help clients attract, develop, motivate, and retain talent. And we also support those organizations in designing the right structures to support that talent. So as you correctly said, I'm part of the RPO business, and we're one of the leading global providers of outsourced talent acquisition solutions. We leverage cutting-edge technology and talent insights to help businesses thrive by finding the right people at scale.
This is why I don't work for Korn Ferry. Dee, you said that so much better than I did. So let's go right into the topic. Now, Dee, I touched on this a bit in my intro, but help me out with the audience. Let's just start off with the basic question. Why is skills-based hiring necessary? And what is different about it? I gave a little bit of overview, but why don't you, sort of delve in and give them some context?
Sure. So skills-based hiring, Elliot, is becoming necessary purely due to the changing landscapes across our workforce. So it's things like technology advancements, the impact of the pandemic, changes in our demographics, and globalization. So what we're seeing there is that skills required in future organizations are different to what we've needed in the past. And in fact, according to our research, skill sets for jobs have changed by 25% since 2015, and we're expecting this number to double by 2027. So what that means is that some skills in organisations are going to sunset, so become obsolete, and others are going to start to sunrise or start to emerge. And to meet the requirements of skills in the future, organisations need to really assess what skills companies have. We need to understand the skills that exist in our organisation and whether they are transferable to different roles. And if we look more holistically, there are several pieces of research which predict a shortage of skills, and that makes it really challenging. So if you think about or take it back to our research, we've indicated that 72% of CEOs felt the lack of critical skills is a threat to business growth. So that's pretty significant. While we're talking about skills, I think we need to really think about, what is skills? And skills is certainly something that we're talking a lot about, but it really does cover a lot of ground. At its core, it combines technical abilities, behavioural competencies, and personal identity, which are learned or developed over the course of somebody's career through the roles they hold, the challenges they face, and the mistakes they make. So technical skills are knowledge-based and they are used for practical tasks. So they often involve tools like technology, practices, or methods, and they can typically be trained. The more difficult aspect to really assess and to think about from a hiring perspective are things like the behavioural skills. So things that are observable or soft skills, which are more difficult to quantify, but they're related to attributes. And they're also really tough to develop. And in addition to that, personal identity. So who you are, why you do what you do, and your drivers and motivators. And this is something that's pretty difficult to change. So we also know from our research that performance differentiation is not to be found in the technical skills, but it's in the soft behavioural side. So for example, if you have 5 people who all have the same technical skills, so for example, advanced Excel, then how do you know who's going to perform the best? And it's typically the ones who will communicate well, who will collaborate well, and who are learning agile. So I think to your point where this is not different, it's certainly something we have been doing in the past. I think a lot of hiring managers have really focused quite heavily on technical skills, university degrees, as opposed to what are those things that are really driving success, which is the things like collaboration, learning agility, which is certainly something that we do focus on quite heavily at Korn Ferry. We believe that learning agility does enable people to continue to be agile in learning and adapting to new skills and environments. And so the focus on evaluating talent fit for a role should be more about measuring those elements as skills validation. And this is certainly one of the most challenging aspects of this movement for organisations to get to grips with, especially now that AI is doing more and more of the TA process in the skills space.
I had another question that I was going to ask you, but before I move to that, 2 things. One is I'm just struck that we still refer to what are probably the most important skills that people have, which is their ability to interact, team, and communicate with others as the soft skills. I think that's mislabeled. But the reality is that if you're the head of HR for a large organization, you almost have to reimagine the company as a series of interlocking skills maps that people need to have rather than think of it as purely based on qualifications or people, etc. Because some of those skills might be ones that are deployed digitally, as in the bots and AI. Some of those skills are going to be, hired in, to your point. But have many of the clients that you've worked with really gotten to the point where they can sort of re-envision the company on a skills mapped basis?
I think a lot of organisations are talking about this, Elliot. And so what we're finding at the moment is there is a lot of discussion about it in the market. There's a lot of organisations that are thinking about, how do we do this effectively? But organisations who have actually achieved this in full, I think, are relatively limited. We're not seeing a lot of that at the start. We're certainly seeing a lot of people on the early part of that journey. And I think to your point as well earlier, this is certainly not something that is new. I think some people have been and had to hire people more based on soft skills as opposed to technical skills. So it's certainly not new, but I think we're moving into that space where it's becoming much more important and organisations are really starting to grapple with that.
All right, so I'm sold. You got me. I'm in. Now, the question. Companies should implement more effective skills-based hiring programs. But let's discuss the obstacles. And you and I have already had this conversation. Many applicant tracking and candidate relationship management programs use keyword matching that does not lend easily to the switch to skills-based hiring. Also, hiring managers need to change their mode of thinking and how they do interviews. Can you give us some examples or case studies or best practices that Korn Ferry have or that you know of that have been used to achieve an effective skills-based hiring program overcoming these aforementioned obstacles?
So we're finding that, as we said earlier, there is quite a lot of hype around skills-based hiring, but in reality, few organisations are doing this effectively. So firstly, one of the things that we do find is that there are a lot of tools out there that include skills libraries with thousands of skills for each job. It's actually quite overwhelming. And we call it the Netflix effect, because when you turn on Netflix, you're faced with so much content that you can't really decide what to watch. And it's the same with skill set libraries. Secondly, we're finding that we need to get hiring managers on board, and this is one of the most difficult parts of our journey. We need to get them thinking less about technical skills and experience and more about skills in general. And this is where effective change management comes into play. We are working with many of our clients here at Korn Ferry to help them define this type of thinking. And one good example is a client in the professional services industry. So they were finding that they were hiring a lot of salespeople from their number one competitor. And when they got them into their organization, they were leaving early or they were unsuccessful in their roles. So we worked with them to perform a study around the skills that were predicting successful outcomes in their organization. And we did this through analysis of assessment results and benchmarking those results against some key performance data. And this allowed us to understand the skills and the traits that were more likely to predict performance and retention. Once we had this data, we were able to develop a success profile for them to hire against in the future. So this was the first piece of the puzzle, was really helping them understand through a data-driven way, what are the things that are more likely to predict success in their business. So as I said earlier, the education piece is key. So we then showed the hiring managers the data from that performance study. And this was an important part of the education process. We were shifting them away from that skills focus and more into attributes hiring. And it was really good to be able to show them the results of that study so that we could actually prove to them what was predicting success in those roles. And it wasn't the technical skills. So the CEO was on board with this approach, and he really supported us to make sure that we hired people and helped the organisation hire against the skills-based profile. We then built the attraction strategy to attract people in a skills-based way. And as I said earlier, it is important to talk about the skills needed and not the experience. And that's a really important part of the attraction strategy. So the attraction strategy that we built them provided a better candidate yield because it spoke to the skills needed. And we were then able to open up some of the industries that we were targeting and the individuals that we were looking for through that strategy. So for me, the education process is really important for hiring managers. And the education piece goes across the whole talent spectrum in relation to skills-based hiring, including talent acquisition and mobility. And it's important also to educate candidates when it comes to internal mobility so that they understand well how to position their skills.
One of the arguments that people who are promoting this, whether they be folks at Korn Ferry or internal executives who want to go to this model, is they say that this approach leads to more equitable outcomes, broader talent pools, better hiring processes. So how does a firm like Korn Ferry, as an example, help companies implement these programs to ensure that they have more equitable outcomes, broader talent pools, better hiring processes? What is it that's, helping it drive, equity and broader talent pools?
Yeah, I think it's important to think about skills across the whole talent spectrum. So placing skills at the heart of talent strategies, ensuring employees' capabilities are aligned with both current and future needs. So by doing so, organisations can definitely become more agile and they can respond to changes and place talent where it is most needed. However, to shift to skills-based hiring, it will ultimately live or die by the effectiveness of change management. In relation to better hiring processes, we need to ensure that the hiring process is more aligned to how people will be measured once they're in the role. And back to your question around the DE&I perspective, I think skills-based hiring can really support an organisation's DE&I agenda. And I think firstly, data points. So where do we hire from? For example, adjacent industries to source relevant skills. Elliot, you and I have talked before about people coming out of the military, for example, and going into different roles and how we apply those skills into new environments. So those types of situations create that opportunity for us to broaden out talent pools that we can attract and source from. Secondly, hiring is based on skills, not experience. So we're not excluding people based on the time in the market or how long they've been in a role. So I think that's really helpful because it means that people are actually being measured against what they bring to the table and not how long they've been in the workforce. I think thirdly, it also provides a fresh perspective. So you can increase your diversity of thought from hiring outside of your industry. And recently, I think a really good example of skills-based hiring that I saw was, you talked a little bit before about some of the challenges that we have. One of those that we do have with some hiring managers is that they feel that the roles that they hire for are so important to have the technical skills. And recently I was at a conference and I was congratulating somebody who had moved into a new role, and that role was a finance role. And I actually said to her, congratulations on your move. This sounds like a great opportunity for you. I didn't realize you had a finance background. And she said, I don't. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting that somebody has moved into an accounting and finance role without a finance background, because we typically see in that side not a lot of those types of moves where skills are required that are so technically based. So at Korn Ferry, we're currently helping organisations implement these processes in a number of ways. Firstly, we're helping them create success profiles that determine what's expected in the job and what are the skills required to do the job. We're also supporting the development of tools, so interview guides, that help with structured conversations around candidate suitability for roles. This is a big one, which is around supporting internal mobility. So I talked a lot about educating hiring managers, but there's also a need to help candidates position their skills in a skills-based environment. And that's certainly something that we're helping candidates with through internal mobility strategies and support that we provide to candidates in that environment. So we're big believers at Korn Ferry in assessment tools, and we know that they will provide the best approach to assessing non-technical skills. When we're assessing skills that are more attribute or skill-based, for example, adaptability or learning agility, the best way to assess those skills in the most predictively valid way is via assessment. The other piece that we also support in is pay data. So we're able to provide pay data to organisations to allow for consistent and equal reward decisions, which will minimise pay gaps. So there's some of the things, Elliot, that we're doing. I'm sure there's certainly a lot of other strategies out there, but that's the advice that we're providing our clients at this point in time around skills-based hiring.
We're out of time, but I could talk about this for a long time, because I actually think that the world, as I said in my opening, is relearning how to appraise candidates on, a broader scope than what the computers are doing. And we sort of have to learn past, the way some of the ATSs are set up today, and get to some of these practices that you're talking about. So, Dee, we're going to have you back to continue this conversation, because I think it's an important one. I think skills-based hiring is a discipline that organizations need to improve upon. So to our listeners, if you're considering skills-based hiring as a model, it's not just words. There's a whole panoply of preparation, planning, and analysis that goes into it, and then a lot of things that you need to work with your managers and your executives to sort of get them on board. But that's a conversation for another day. I want to thank Deanne Barbary, who's Vice President and Senior Client Partner for Korn Ferry RPO in the APAC region. Dee, thanks so much for taking part in the podcast.
Thank you, Elliot. It was fantastic to speak with you, and thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
My pleasure. And to our audience, thank you so much for your time and attention, and we'll look forward to having you join us in our next HRO Today Educational Podcast.